Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I wish I could be with you all in person. I was in Christchurch 6 years ago now, and I think of it fondly. I'm speaking to you today from my home in Seattle. And for the next 18 minutes, we're going to talk about what's happening in climate change and why we believe there's a brighter future ahead. And I'll bring it back at the end to how this affects all of you in New Zealand and the work that you do, and how the greatest challenges of climate can be a huge opportunity for New Zealand food and fiber producers. So let's start. I believe, as an unpopular opinion in this day and age, that we are headed for a brighter future. And when I wrote my third book that was about solving the climate crisis and feeding the world and other climate, environment, and resource challenges, I quoted from A Tale of Two Cities that started with the phrase, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Because right now is the best of times for most of humanity. If you look at every bad metric of poverty, hunger, disease, minus the current pandemic, all of these things have been dropping for 150 years. If you look at how many people on Earth have a long life, education, access to knowledge, all of these have been rising for 150 years. This is the best time to be born on planet Earth ever. Why could it possibly be the worst of times then? Because we also have some challenges larger than we've ever seen before. We have challenges of climate and other resource constraints, energy, food, water, forests, oceans. And at the same time, we have rising demand around the world for housing, energy, food, meat, materials, everything that you can imagine. And so you see this manifest. This is Shanghai in the 1970s, and this is Shanghai today. And it's not just about one city or one country. This is a global story of billions of people rising out of poverty. But this rise out of poverty that's lifting up so many means more use of electricity, of energy to heat these buildings, of water, steel, cement, more consumption of food. We see it in freshwater usage around the world rising at a stunning rate, continues to rise with no obvious end in sight. We see it with the world's forests, where once upon a time, 2/3 of the world's land area was covered in forest, and now it's only about 1/2 of the world that's covered in forest. We see the number one driver of this being agriculture, and especially animal agriculture. And yet, the world inexorably wants more meat. This is global meat consumption for the last 70 or so years. And you see that it rises without bound, and it's going to continue to rise for decades to come. And then there's a challenge of climate itself. The world is getting warmer. This is temperature from 1880 to today, and you see how it oscillates, doesn't go up every single year, but as you zoom out, it's just inexorably true that the planet is heating up. This causes major challenges to precipitation. It changes rainfall patterns. It can cause droughts, it can cause flooding, it can feed massive fires, as your neighbors in Australia suffered, or my neighbors in California suffered in past years. And it's starting to affect New Zealand. It's affecting New Zealand wine growers. It's affecting New Zealand salmon producers, with a major salmon producer having to shut down its farms as more than 40% of fish died from unprecedentedly warm waters. So climate is no longer in the future. It's here and now as a challenge to all of us on planet Earth. The good news is we are making progress. There is an incredible $200 trillion revolution underway in deploying and inventing new climate technologies. Let's start with energy. The number one producer of carbon emissions around the world is electricity. And we've gone from a phase where clean electricity was ultra expensive to where it's the cheapest power on Earth. And that's driven this huge surge in investment. In 2004, the world spent $32 billion a year on clean energy. This year, 2021, we spent more than 750 billion. In 2022, even with possible recessions and so on around the world, we're on track to spend $1 trillion in a single year deploying clean energy. That's really clean electricity, solar and wind, and batteries and electric vehicles. But this will spread into other sectors of sustainability. We will see incredible growth in clean industrial products like in steel and cement, and in clean fabrics, clean fashion, clean food, food that is carbon neutral or carbon negative. This is a secular trend. The world only goes one way. In electricity, what's happened is that the cost of solar power and wind power has been in free fall for the last 20 or more years. But especially in this last 10 years or 12, it's gone from being more expensive to make electricity from solar and wind than from coal or gas anywhere on Earth, to being cost competitive, and now to being cheaper to build new solar or wind in many parts of the world than it is to keep operating an already built coal or gas plant. The price of wind power around the world has dropped by a factor of 8 over the last few decades. The price of solar power has dropped even faster. If you look at solar panels themselves, they have gone, if you look at the cost per watt of a solar panel, from in 1975 costing $100 per watt to in 2020 costing 20 cents per watt. That's a 500 times price decline in that piece of time. And that's unlike anything else in the physical world. And that means now in more and more parts of the world, we have crossover where solar is simply the cheapest energy that you can buy, period. In China, solar is surging, being driven by unsubsidized projects because solar is now cheaper than new coal. And the cost of solar power in China dropped by a factor of 7 in the last decade. In the US, solar is now the cheapest source of electricity. Globally, around 90% of new electricity generation deployed last year was clean electricity. Solar prices dropped by a factor of 6 in the last decade in the US. We even have the rise of something called agrivoltaics, the use of solar panels on farms, sometimes ground mounted like this, sometimes elevated far above in combination with crops or animals. And in many places, the animals love it because they get a shady area, and certain crops love it as well if they get complete or partial shade for some part of the year. So all of this is happening faster than any expert expected. The world's leading experts on energy are the IEA, the International Energy Agency. And if we look at their predictions over the last 20 or so years, like colored lines going out to the right, these are the predictions of how much solar the world would install per year. The black line is what actually happened. Every year, the leading experts on energy have said, growth is over. We're going to keep installing the same amount of solar in the future that we have in the past. And every year, the number has actually gone up and up. And that's because the surprise is because the leading experts thought the cost of solar would drop at about this rate. And here's what actually happened. Solar prices are actually 50 to 100 years ahead of where the world's leading energy experts thought they'd be just 12 years ago. And that's extending now to energy storage, to batteries. Similar things are happening. The cost of batteries has dropped by a factor of 10 in the last decades, meaning you can save solar power or wind power for use at night, and these trends will continue for the coming years. And again, the US Department of Energy thought battery prices would drop at about this rate. They dropped by about a third between 2013 and 2050. And instead, they actually dropped like the yellow line. Again, the cost of clean, sustainable options decades ahead. That, in turn, this rise of batteries will do incredible things for transportation. which means incredible things to oil. Transportation is about 20% of New Zealand's carbon emissions. And we are headed for a situation in oil where the world needs less oil because it's cheaper to move ourselves with other means. And the first person to say that was actually a Saudi, Sheikh Ahmed Yamani, who said in the year 2000 that the Stone Age didn't end for a lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil. He was ahead of his time, but it's now clear that we're going to electrify transportation. I know it's starting in New Zealand, it's not as advanced as it is some places, but it's now inevitable that almost all ground equipment, all ground transport, and much heavy equipment will be electrified. What we see is that around the world, even through the COVID years, sales of electric cars surged. They kept growing. They've grown by a factor of 80 in the last decade. Even as they've grown, they've taken more and more market share. Globally, about 12% of new cars sold are electric. That might sound like not very much, and in a way it's not, but that was effectively zero 10 years ago. In some parts of the world, in Europe, they're 17% and growing by leaps and bounds. Growing so fast that we've now hit the peak of sales of gasoline and diesel cars. That happened in 2017. That's the year that this green bar, internal combustion engine cars, their sales per year peaked, even as electric vehicles have grown and grown and grown. And it's going to just happen faster and faster because, like solar and wind, electric vehicles are plunging in price in a way that gasoline vehicles can't match. And it's happening because of this. This is the entire engine and drivetrain of an electric car. It has about 20 moving parts. This is the engine and drivetrain of a gasoline vehicle. It has more than 1,000 moving parts. So building an electric vehicle takes far less labor, far less equipment. Ford says it takes half the factory space and half the factory cost. And as batteries get cheaper and scale happens in electric vehicles, they will undeniably be cheaper. By the middle or second half of this decade, it will be cheaper in most parts of the world to buy an electric car upfront than it is to buy a gasoline-powered car. And on top of that, this will happen to electric vans, light trucks, delivery vehicles. It'll happen to semi-tractor trailers as batteries get lighter and smaller and cheaper. And that means we're headed for the end of the oil age. It won't happen all at once. Oil demand is still growing. Oil is expensive right now, but at the rate at which electric vehicles are growing, we will see the consumption of oil around the world peak in the middle or second half of this decade and then start to drop. There are tailwinds behind all of this that drive the world towards more and more green solutions. One of those tailwinds is consumers. Consumers have signaled that they want green and clean products. This list of logos are the RE100. These are companies around the world that have committed that by 2030, 100% of the electricity they use will be clean electricity. And this is basically tech companies and consumer brands. But this will spread, and it will spread beyond electricity to clean transportation, and then to clean fabrics and building materials, to clean heat, and to climate-friendly food as well, because consumers want it. It'll also happen because of policy, because globally, while we hear about policy failures, it's clear things are headed in only one direction. Europe is moving towards complete decarbonization by 2050. Even the United States, where we have done very little federally, US states such as California and New York have laws that will make them completely carbon neutral by 2045 or 2050, putting pressure on all sorts of carbon emitting goods. China committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. Last year, India by 2070. So we have to see more details and more teeth to this. This is a pledge, not a policy, but it's coming. So is the problem solved? Have we conquered climate change? No. We are in a race between our pace of innovation in making better and cheaper sustainable technologies and products versus our pace of consumption. And it's still not totally clear who or what is going to win. But I'll tell you that I'm an optimist. And I'm an optimist because of this. When I came into the climate world 12 years ago, we were on path for 4, 5, or 6 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. And that is truly cataclysmic. That is the stuff of nightmares. Now, the mix of policy and ever cheaper green technologies means that we're on pace for somewhere below 3 degrees Celsius of warming, maybe as low as 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And that is a curve that we've bent. We have moved the needle on this, but we still have more to go. There are unsolved problems beyond electricity and cars and trucks. Industrial emissions are part of it, but the biggest of them is agriculture and land use. That's a quarter of all emissions. So we have to conquer those emissions at the same time that the world needs more food. As people rise into the middle class, around the world, we need to grow 80% more food by 2050 with less water, much of that driven by rising demand for meat. But we've done it before. Since the Green Revolution started, we've tripled global cereal crops yield per hectare around the world. We've done it for every crop. We've cut the land area that one person on Earth needs on average to be fed by a factor of 2 over the last 50 years. We've gone from hunter-gatherer times when we needed 3,000 acres per person on planet Earth, more than 1,000 hectares, to now less than 1/3 of an acre per person on Earth to feed them. So we've done it before, we can keep doing it. Now, what does this mean for all of you at an event about food and fiber? Well, I believe as an investor and as a human being that our greatest challenges can be our greatest opportunities. And for New Zealand, climate has 2 challenges. It has the challenge of the impact it will have on New Zealand and the challenge that half of New Zealand's carbon emissions come from agriculture. And this does not mean that we should cease agriculture or anything like it. But I think that this is a trend that we will see, that agriculture has not been under pressure from climate policy or from consumers, but it will be. But that challenge is an enormous opportunity. We see now that when consumers shop, more than a quarter think about food sustainability when they're in a grocery store. 83% of consumers say they would substitute beef with something else that was more sustainable once per week. This will only rise over time. Impossible Foods is a $7 billion company from creating one plant-based burger. The rate of growth of meat alternatives is fierce. This is a very optimistic about them projection that says they could be more than $100 billion market 6 years from now. But if you look at this, they're still far, far less than 1% of the food that people eat. And even that percent by global market value is exaggerating how big they will be. No matter how fast alternative proteins grow, demand for actual meat is going to rise. Customers want meat, but they want it to be sustainable. And that's where the opportunity is. Because if New Zealand producers of both food and fiber can claim legitimately to be the most sustainable producers, they can tap into this market. And there are a number of resources I'll point you to. The Nature Conservancy has a roadmap on sustainable beef, and much this applies to other livestock as well. There's numerous reports on how to reduce the methane emissions, which are the major culprit in New Zealand from livestock. And there's now at least 8 startups that have taken a discovery made a decade ago that cows fed a certain strain of seaweed had their methane emissions cut by more than 80% and are now trying to commercialize this. This is the best known of them, Mucho. And intriguingly, it looks like when livestock are fed these supplements, not only do they have lower methane production, but their milk production and their meat production goes up because the energy that they would lose as methane instead is turned into more production that's actually economically viable. So I believe that New Zealand's climate challenge is a potential market opportunity that those who are leaders in producing the most sustainable food and fiber will be able to profit by reaching consumers who increasingly want clean options. Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be here with you.